I think the end game is disastrous for us because we will ultimately be blamed for this failure, this tremendous strategic debacle that we've created. It's going to become obvious to Europeans that there was no threat from Russian invasion, that the Russians do not threaten Europe today, nor do they have any interest in threatening Europe. They would like to do business with Europe. And the Europeans would like to get back to business with the Russians. They had a very mutually beneficial economic arrangement, particularly between Germany and Russia. That's what people are going to want to get back to. On the other hand, people are going to begin to question what's the purpose of having this U.S. military establishment and diplomatic presence in our countries when the only thing the Americans seem to be interested in doing is starting wars and dragging us into them. So I think we will eventually be invited to leave. How soon will that happen? I think it'll begin as soon as the truth sinks in. And thus far, what's amazing has been our ability, working closely between the CIA and MI6, the intelligence branch in London, to create these false narratives, to create the illusion that we were doing something good when we were doing something very bad. And as a result, when that happens, yes, I think our position in Europe is about done. It's about finished.
Douglas Macgregor's words bring to light a reality that is beginning to dawn across Europe. The Russia-Ukraine war is not just a conflict between two nations. It is a symptom of much larger geopolitical failures, especially those orchestrated by the West. The United States, in particular, finds itself at the center of this crisis, having played a pivotal role in pushing the boundaries of what Macgregor calls false narratives. Narratives that have dragged Europe into a war it never wanted, with consequences far worse than anticipated. To fully grasp the scale of this debacle, we must first revisit the origins of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The 2014 events in Ukraine, the ousting of a pro-Russian government in Kiev, the installation of a Western-backed regime, and the subsequent civil unrest in eastern Ukraine, set the stage for what would become a full-scale war in 2022. According to Macgregor and other military experts, Russia was pushed to the brink. NATO's expansion eastward, coupled with U.S. military aid and involvement in Ukraine, became an existential threat in the eyes of Moscow. The result? Russia intervened. From their perspective, this was a defensive move, a necessity to prevent NATO forces from positioning themselves right on Russia's doorstep. But to the Western media and political establishment, this was presented as Russian aggression, an unjustified attack on a peaceful neighbor. The reality, as Macgregor suggests, is far more complicated. This war could have been avoided if Western powers, particularly the United States, had taken Russia's security concerns seriously. Now, almost 3 years into the war, the toll is staggering. As Macgregor has pointed out in previous discussions, over 600,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. These are World War I levels of loss, a scale of devastation that is hard to fathom in the modern era. What's worse, the outcome is becoming increasingly clear. Ukraine has lost this war. For Ukraine, the war has been a disaster of monumental proportions. Its infrastructure is in ruins, its economy has collapsed, and millions of its citizens have fled the country in search of safety. The once vibrant cities of Ukraine, such as Mariupol, Kharkiv, and others, have been reduced to rubble. And for what? A war that was avoidable, driven by geopolitical gamesmanship rather than any genuine concern for the Ukrainian people. As Macgregor suggests, Europe is waking up to the truth. Many European leaders, and the public at large, are beginning to understand that Russia never intended to invade Europe. The Russians, in fact, want to do business with Europe, especially with key countries like Germany, with whom they had strong economic ties before the conflict. These ties, particularly in the energy sector, were mutually beneficial. Russia supplied Germany with natural gas, and Germany, in turn, supported the Russian economy through trade. This was a win-win situation for both sides, until the war in Ukraine disrupted everything. The war has not only been catastrophic for Ukraine, but also for Europe. The sanctions imposed on Russia have backfired in many ways, harming European economies while failing to deter Russian actions. Energy prices have skyrocketed, inflation is rampant, and the political unity of Europe is fraying. Countries like Hungary and Serbia have openly criticized the EU's approach, while others, like Germany and France, are dealing with the domestic fallout of a failing economic strategy. Macgregor points out a critical question that Europeans are now asking. Why is the US still here? What is the purpose of having an American military presence in Europe when the primary justification for it, the so-called Russian threat, does not exist? For decades, the United States has maintained bases and military infrastructure across Europe under the guise of protecting its allies. But now, many Europeans are beginning to see this presence for what it is, a tool for Washington to maintain influence and drag Europe into conflicts that serve U.S. interests, not European ones. As the truth sinks in, as Macgregor puts it, the U.S. will likely be invited to leave. Europe no longer needs American troops stationed across the continent, especially when those troops are associated with wars like the one in Ukraine. Wars that have no benefit for the average European citizen, but have caused immense suffering and instability. Macgregor doesn't mince words when he talks about the false narratives that have driven U.S. foreign policy. He highlights the collaboration between intelligence agencies like the CIA and MI6 in crafting these stories. These narratives, pushed by the media and echoed by political leaders, have created a distorted view of the world. The American people, and much of Europe, have been led to believe that Russia is the enemy, that NATO is the defender of freedom, and that the U.S. is a force for good. But as the war in Ukraine has shown, this is far from the truth. The reality is that Western intervention in Ukraine, under the guise of democracy and freedom, was designed to serve broader geopolitical ambitions. Ukraine became a pawn in a much larger game, a tool to weaken Russia and assert Western dominance in Eastern Europe. But this gamble has failed. Ukraine has been devastated, and Russia, while facing significant economic challenges, has not collapsed. Instead, it has strengthened its alliances with countries like China and India, while Europe has been left to pick up the pieces of a shattered relationship. As Macgregor predicts, the fallout from this war will lead to a decline in U.S. influence in Europe. Countries that once relied on American military protection and diplomatic support are now questioning the value of that relationship. France and Germany have already signaled their desire for a more independent foreign policy, one that is not tied to Washington's agenda. Hungary, under Viktor Orban, has openly challenged U.S. policies, while countries like Turkey have pursued their own interests, even if it means defying NATO. This trend will only continue as the truth about the Russia-Ukraine war becomes impossible to ignore. European leaders will have to face their own populations, who are growing increasingly frustrated with the economic hardship and political instability that this war has caused. The U.S. military presence in Europe, once seen as a symbol of security, is now viewed as a liability, a force that drags Europe into unnecessary conflicts and leaves it to deal with the consequences. So, what does the future hold? As Macgregor suggests, the U.S. position in Europe is about finished. This doesn't mean that American influence will disappear overnight, but the long-term trajectory is clear. European countries will seek to re-establish economic ties with Russia, pursue more independent foreign policies, and distance themselves from U.S. military interventions. The Russia-Ukraine war has been a wake-up call for Europe. It has exposed the dangers of relying too heavily on American narratives and following Washington's lead into conflicts that do not serve European interests. As the dust settles, Europe will likely move towards a more balanced approach to foreign policy, one that prioritizes its own economic and security needs over the demands of the U.S. According to Douglas Macgregor, I think the endgame is disastrous for us because we will ultimately be blamed for this failure, this tremendous strategic debacle that we've created. It's going to become obvious to Europeans that there is no threat from Russian invasion, that the Russians do not threaten Europe today, nor do they have any interest in threatening Europe, and they would like to do business with Europe. And the Europeans would like to get back to business with the Russians. They had a very mutually beneficial economic arrangement, particularly between Germany and Russia. That's what people are going to want to get back to. On the other hand, people are going to begin to question, what's the purpose of having this U.S. military establishment and diplomatic presence in our countries when the only thing the Americans seem to be interested in doing is starting wars and dragging us into them? So, I think we will eventually be invited to leave. How soon will that happen? I think it will begin as soon as the truth sinks in. And thus far, what's amazing has been our ability, working closely between the CIA and MI6, the intelligence branch in London, to create these false narratives, to create the illusion that we were doing something good when we were doing something very bad. And as a result, when that happens, yes, I think our position in Europe is about done. It's about finished. Thanks for watching.